In this podcast, we explore what sets large academic medical institutions apart from smaller sites in the context of clinical trials. We will discuss the following. Number one, 6 unique issues that large academic institutions think about during clinical trial negotiations. Number 2, the role of tax-exempt municipal bonds in clinical trial negotiations. Number 3, the Bayh-Dole Act and how it impacts publication rights. Number 4, whether sponsors have the right to be present during an FDA audit. Number 5, whether sponsors have a right to review and change a proposed audit response. In this episode, we're thrilled to have Istvan Fekete. He's the director at Huron, and he has over a decade of expertise in negotiating clinical trial agreements and brings a wealth of insights to the table. Let's dissect this together. What are large academic medical institutions responsible for that sponsors or other commercial entities are generally not?
That's a tough one. That is a tough one. When you think about stuff the universities have to follow, let me take some notes here real quick. Some things that pop to mind immediately are, publication.
Yep.
There are private use bond covenants, requirement regarding subject injury to treat patients equally. And this comes in with the concept of submitting to insurance before you submit to the sponsor for subject injury reimbursement.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I have with us Ish. Ish has been on with us multiple times before. He is always loved when we put things onto LinkedIn or the YouTube channel. People love to listen to him talk. But our topic today is going to be about what make large academic medical center research processes, contract negotiation processes, different from, say, a small research site, or what sponsors would typically expect from a for-profit hospital, if you will. So, Ish, let's start with the basic question. What are the big areas that large academic medical centers tend to think about that sponsors and smaller hospitals or smaller private institutions may not be thinking about in the context of clinical trial negotiation?
I think there's a couple things that pop to mind. There's the concept of publication. There's the concept of the tax-exempt municipal bonds that a lot of our large universities use to finance construction on their campuses, and the restrictions those type of bonds come with. There's there's a moral requirement, so to speak, from the IRB's perspective that we treat all of our patients the same, and that their costs for participating in a given trial are equal. I think another thing that's unique that I hear from the industry side of the house a lot is that, well, universities aren't really in business to make money off of intellectual property. And that's not true. Almost every academic, large academic university that I'm aware of has an entire office dedicated to that exact premise of creating revenue from the intellectual property their scientists develop. I think another thing that gets confused by industry sometimes is that most of these deals are set up through the principal investigator. And something that should be made clear is the principal investigator's desires, goals, and interests don't always align with the institutions and what type of work the institution is willing to facilitate. The final thing that pops to mind, and this is, something I see on both sides of the house, and is this final congruency review between all the documents related to clinical trial agreements, right? Your protocol has to match your contract, which has to match your ICF, which has to match your budget, which has to match your clinical trial management system, which has to match your coverage analysis, right? And so all of these things need to be aligned.
I love it. So let's start with the first one, which is the use of municipal bonds, the tax-exempt municipal bonds. Tell me a little bit more about them. Why are they even a factor in clinical trial negotiations?
The good news is they're rarely a factor in clinical trial negotiations because people argue that clinical trial negotiations fall under the safe harbor exception where there is enough of a tie to patient care that you're meeting the requirements of these bonds. Where the bonds come into play is a lot of the times universities are providing services for clinical trial agreements in addition to just conduct of the trial, right? They're testing samples. They're the data coordinating center. Some universities even offer CRO type of services, right? And in the provision of those services, that's where you see the impact of the tax-exempt municipal bond financing, because what that bond financing says is, okay, this is tax-exempt, but in return for that, the work you conduct in these spaces have to be for the public good. That's why the public is giving you these tax-exempt municipal bonds to ensure that, they can benefit from the work you do in the spaces that they've paid for. And so what that does is it creates private use restrictions for the university, right? Private use comes in true service relationships where the university is doing it for money, right? They should be breaking even because they're a nonprofit, but it's a straight service relationship where there's not publishing. They're not bringing anything to the public domain. It's not about developing generalizable knowledge. It's about providing a service for money. And what the private use restriction says, okay, you have this building, and right, I'm just throwing numbers out here. This is an example. You have this building, and 10% of the space in that building can be used for private use, and the other 90% can't, right? So a pharmaceutical company is talking with the university and saying, hey, we want you to provide us sample analysis services. We're going to pay you $50 a sample. You don't have any rights to the results you generate. You just send them to us, and it's a straight service shop. The university has to make sure that that work and the space that work is being conducted in is either not in a space financed by tax-exempt municipal bond financing, right? Or if it is, then the amount of space being used for that service is not violating the restrictions of how much of the space can be used for private use.
That's a really interesting concept that I've never seen discussed so much. So we want to dig into that a little bit more. When we're talking about these private use restrictions, number one, is that space that we're discussing always a fixed space, or can it keep moving throughout the building depending on the day, the time, whatever? Is it 10% of the full building at any given time should not be for private use, or is it this laboratory that was created cannot be for private use?
It depends on the financing structures of the building, right? So if you have a building that is only partially financed through tax-exempt municipal bonds, right, then you can structure it to where only certain sections of the building are subject to these private use restrictions. And that, truthfully, tax-exempt municipal bond financing is more common for the other buildings at academic, institutions as opposed to the hospital. Right. So the hospital, it's rarer to finance those buildings through tax-exempt municipal bond financing. So I think that's one of the ways that institutions get around this restriction, bubbling up in the clinical care setting. But yeah, you can structure it. Now, if the whole building is financed by tax-exempt municipal bonds, right, then it's not a restriction that this portion of the building has to be where the 10% of the private use works. It's really up to you as an institution. And I've actually seen scenarios where to meet this requirement, you go into a lab and there's machines stacked on top of each other to not violate the percentage of space that can be used for those purposes.
From a practical use perspective, is it as long as the bond is still out there, that's how long this restriction exists? let's say the bond was created in 1990. It was a 15-year bond. So 2005, it's sort of completed. Is that tax-exempt financing rule or requirement still on the hospital, or would it be, you know what, we paid off the bond, the restriction doesn't exist anymore?
I think once the bond is reimbursed, the restriction is removed.
What you've been talking about around private use restrictions and length of time and all those good things, they remind me, these requirements are usually at the local level. They remind me of the Bayh-Dole Act, which is often a federal requirement, and it comes from the development of intellectual property using public use funds. For those people who don't know this, if the government in some way finances the development of intellectual property, the government then develops rights to those intellectual properties. And they have what are called clawback rights, and there are walk-in rights, etc., and the financing rights. So this is reminiscent of a federal law around the Bayh-Dole Act. Is that fair to say, first of all?
Yeah, I think in terms of the realm of obligations, I think it's similar, right? I mean, this is the tax-exempt municipal bond financing requirements are designed to make sure the public is benefited, right? Same thing with Bayh-Dole, right? What's interesting about Bayh-Dole is before Bayh-Dole was passed, the government used to own IP that was developed from their funding. And what everybody realized is the government has no mechanism to license intellectual property so that it's commercialized and brought to the market. And so they said, okay, universities, you can now own the intellectual property you develop from federal funding. But like you said, the government has those rights and those march-in rights to leverage the IP as well for its purposes, right? And that's the connection to make sure that the government is getting value out of the work that they funded.
So, which takes us to this next piece, whether we're talking about the Bayh-Dole Act or we're talking about this municipal bond funding, the impact it has on publication. So tell us about the impact of Bayh-Dole and private use restrictions on publication rights.
I think, again, it goes back to that overarching concept of public benefit, right? The reason we have universities is sure to educate our citizenry, but also to create new knowledge, right? I mean, where the most research is happening in the world is at our academic institutions. And so the point is that they do that research, and the knowledge that is developed through that research is brought to the public so that the public can benefit from it. And also it's by bringing those publications to the market that other scientists see those and build off of them, say, oh, well, that's a really interesting concept. Let me explore this. Let me explore this. And it's when you work in the contracts game, something that I think may be lost on people is how often that happens, where you're facilitating conversations between one PI and another because one PI saw the other's publication and says, oh, I would really like access to that data to do this or those materials, or I would like to replicate it in this way. Those type of conversations are happening all the time. So I think publication is just another mechanism that's part of this ecosystem to make sure that the public is benefiting from these institutions that are getting all kinds of, funding and other benefits from the public.
We always talk about publication in the context of academic research centers and negotiation with academic research centers. Why do we not discuss confidentiality just as much? Because to me, publication is just a broader speak associated with confidentiality. So what is your thought process?
Confidentiality is an interesting concept because in an academic medical center's world, there's two buckets. There's what is given to us and the results we produce. Okay. What is given to us, we don't care about. Confidential, we don't publish on it. Yes, we're going to require a cap and exceptions and things like that, but that's confidential. No controversy there. We don't want to argue about it. The results is where conversations happen. When I do my training for my team and other teams, I always say that there's competing interests, right? The university wants to bring everything to the market. Their industry partner generally only wants things published on that make them look good. Unfavorable publications is not good for business, right? And so results is where the crux of the matter is. But from a university's perspective, when it comes to results, there's two buckets. Again, one bucket is industry-sponsored clinical trial agreements and true service relationships. In those situations, the institution is going to accept that the other organization owns the results and if they're confidential information, right? They're industry partners. With service agreements, universities should not enter into a service agreement if they have publication interests on that project. If they have publication interests on that project, it's not a service relationship. It's not, right? A service relationship is I do X, you get the output, we're done. I'm not doing anything else with it, right? So you're not going to talk about publication in a true service relationship. You're a confidential information company. We don't need to publish on it. Industry-sponsored clinical trials is the only type of research agreement universities enter into where the results are both the industry partners' confidential information and the university requires the right to publish on it. In every other scenario, the university is going to demand that the results are in fact not confidential information, that in fact the university owns the results and can do whatever they want with them, including publish on them. And so I think in the industry-sponsored clinical trial setting, what's interesting about it is how often is an individual PI doing an individual publication on an industry-sponsored clinical trial? They did almost never, right? There may be an author on the multi-site. Now, what does happen that I think gets missed on the industry side a lot is case studies. And I bring this up because there's this language that I'm sure all the farmers went to a conference and talked about it. So now we see it in all the contracts that says you have to publish on the entirety of the data, not a subset of the data. The logic being that, and you saw me make a face there because I don't buy this logic, but the logic being that a subset of the data is going to lead to, potentially erroneous conclusions being drawn. But I think what is discounted there is the concept of case studies, right? This does happen where something interesting happens to one particular patient and the investigator wants to publish on that. And obviously, if I have 3 patients and I'm only publishing on one, I'm publishing on a subset of the data, right? And so I think this concept of case studies, which does happen, I've seen it multiple times. I think that gets discounted in this conversation sometimes.
Not sure I agree with you, and I'll tell you why I don't agree with you. Because I think you're right that it's probably started from the idea of you don't jump to erroneous conclusions. But I think there's also an element of you as a site may not have access to all of the information almost ever. There's no situation where you generally would, in which case I can always say you don't have all of the access to the information, so you cannot publish. So to the point you're making around individual case studies, one might logically argue that you couldn't publish on it in the first place because it's not based on all of the access to all of the information.
It's going to be our standard that nobody's ever going to be able to publish because, like you said, the site's never going to have access to. Exactly. But the way the publication works is the pharma, it's not like the pharma's blindsided. They always get a right to review, comment, delay for patent filings. So the pharma has the opportunity during that review period to say, hey, PI, we have this other data that came up during the study that we feel like is material to your publication, right? So I think there's mechanisms built into the process to allow that necessary feedback loop to occur. And I would draw an analogy here to FDA inspections where sponsors are either adamant they have to be present or at least be available, right? And I look at these situations in the way that the motivations are inherently aligned, in that In an FDA inspection, institution wants to issue the best response possible. If the sponsor has information to help them issue that response, right, we're all on the same side of that conversation. And in the publication world, the PI wants their publication to be the best that it can be and the most accurate. And so if the sponsor has additional information to give them during the publication review process that will make that more accurate, that's not something that the PI would push back on or be apprehensive about, because the goals in terms of that publication being accurate are aligned as well.
Two responses to that. So we're getting into these interesting side channels, if you will. So thank you for getting us into it. But the first question you raised was, you're right in that there are these mechanisms out there, which is you put out a potential publication, pharma gets a chance to look at it, comment on it. At that point, it comes down to, what do you want to allow for that engagement? And what I mean by that is, on one hand, you might be able to stick to the language of the contract and say, you can't publish anything because it's not based on the full agreement. And what I mean by that is, you need access to the full data. You'd never have access to the full data. You can't publish. To your point, however, that sets up an adversarial relationship with a physician who, by definition, may be a target physician once you get into the actual marketing phase. So you're not incentivized as a pharma to, quote unquote, piss him off right now. So I think that plays a larger role than academic medical institutions really think about. Do you think that sponsors should have the right to be present during an FDA audit in a large medical center?
I don't. I think what makes sense for everybody involved is that the sponsor is available during the audit or inspection, right? That can be on site in a separate room. That can be via a phone call, but it's problematic to have them ride along with the entire inspection. And I'll explain why. Most of these FDA inspections don't have to do with one single clinical trial. They are broader audits of the institution, right? And that's why in the language, we never say the audit is solely related to that clinical trial where the institution has an obligation to notify the sponsor, but that could impact or may impact or will impact, right, the trial that is being conducted. And so from an institution's perspective, there's also considerations of confidentiality, right? They're not trying to disclose their entire business processes and everything, right, that they may disclose during an audit that also may be related to other trials, right? There could be other trials that they're talking about, and then you have to worry about confidentiality. You can't let one CRO know what's going on with another CRO or one pharma with another pharma, right? And so it's more complicated than, hey, sponsor, just show up and ride along with this inspection. And the bottom line is, it's not the sponsor being audited. Yes, it can have implications for the sponsor, sure, but we're required to share all correspondence and all responses with them, right? So they know what's up. And so that's the thing, is it's the institution being audited. Obviously, if a sponsor was audited, they would want to control the audit process, right? That is no different on the institution side. And what I find interesting is a lot of institutions now require the sponsors to make debarment reps, similar to what's required of the institutions. And sometimes you get pushback on this, and it's like, why would a sponsor think that the institution has any different concerns in terms of working with a debarred individual than the sponsor has, right? It's the exact same side of the coin. And I talk about that because on the FDA inspection side, right, sponsors get audited all the time. Their sites on clinical trials have no idea that these things are happening, right? And so I think, we need to talk about these things so we play nice in the sandbox together.
So let's then take on another question that comes on, which is, should sponsors have the right of review and change a proposed FDA audit in the case of a larger academic medical center review? Because again, this is where I think smaller sites have an incentive to work with the resources of a larger sponsor. But in the case of a larger academic institution, they may have their own resources, which may not want sponsor input or may say that the sponsor input is more a distraction than helpful. So what is your take?
I think it is appropriate for universities to be required to run their responses to FDA audits by the sponsor prior to issuing them if that FDA audit impacts that sponsor's study. I do not think the sponsor cannot have editorial rights over that response because, again, they are not being audited. Can you imagine an organization saying that this third party has the right to essentially dictate how we respond to an audit of our institution, right? We can see kind of the problematic nature of that. But I do think the sponsor can have information that is helpful, right? Similar to the publication paradigm that you're talking about. We don't have all the data related to their product and their program and everything like that. They do. So this concept of having them review it, in my opinion, the academic institution should look at it as a mutually beneficial feedback loop, right? Where the sponsor is made aware of what's going on. They can provide additional information that could potentially be helpful in your response. And then it's up to you as an institution to decide to what extent you're gonna, leverage that information that has been provided. So I do think review is an appropriate thing to mandate of sites.
So I think what you're talking about is this right to comment, if you will, which we see often enough. So great point. I want to also add another component and close up the conversation around publication rights, because we were talking about how sponsors may not be incentivized to put out all of the information, say for clinical trials that didn't go very well. I would argue that there are two different pieces between clinicaltrials.gov and UDRA-CT. And with the new clinical trials guidelines that have come out from Europe, there are requirements for 6 different types of transparency that may prevent sponsors in the future from arguing, and it's not even the future, like in the present, from arguing that certain types of clinical results cannot be published. So I feel like to that end, the argument that sponsors are trying to hide publication results becomes less of an issue. And I'll give you the 6 types of clinical trial transparency. There is the actual, we have a study. So that's like the old form version of clinicaltrials.gov. The second one is, here are the study results, which is the publication on clinicaltrials.gov. But now you got into these newer sets, which is, here's the raw data that we got answers to. And we see some sponsors in the US already doing that. Then you've got the other version, which is, here's the clinical study report, a redacted version, a minimally redacted version of the clinical study report, which now has to be published. There's one so that's 4. Number 5 is this idea that we need these study results to be in a format that patients understand. So lay summaries, if you will. And then there's this emerging one that's coming out more and more, which is a simplified version of what do scientists need to take away? So sometimes scientists don't need the publication and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to know what the takeaway of the study is. I see, and there are other emerging versions. For example, ICMJ requires that all studies be published. So this is not just a European requirement, but you've got private players like ICMJ, the International Journal of Medical Editors. I forget what it all stands for. I should know because I've taught medical writing for 12 years. But ICMJ requirements include the idea of the results have to be published before we will publish anything for you. So I think this
requires, real quick, Darshan, just to throw out there for everybody, that the study be registered prior to enrollment of the first patient. So just be aware of that, folks.
Exactly. So there are these different levels of publication and transparency that are coming out. So keep that in mind as people continue. We have not even touched the second topic as we had planned. So before we go, one quick question for you. Give me a 30-second takeaway on what is the takeaway for today's conversation?
I think the takeaway from today's conversation is that if you work in industry, you need to understand these things, right? The more you understand about the unique stipulations that these academic medical centers are under, the more efficiently you can navigate them and the easier it will be for you to align expectations with your internal stakeholders, right? And so this is both a conversation of me telling universities, let them review your FDA responses, and me telling, the pharmaceutical industry to be aware of these other things that universities are concerned about, because that should make it easier for all of us to work nicely together in the sandbox.
I love it. Thank you again, Ish.
Thanks, Darshan.